Have you ever wondered how one moment of disrespect can destroy a lifetime of success? On a cold Monday morning, the headquarters of Carter Technologies was buzzing with excitement as employees rushed through the glass doors, trying not to be late for an important board meeting. The company's young CEO, Daniel Carter, was famous for his intelligence, wealth, and ruthless attitude. Everyone feared him because one small mistake could cost an employee their job. That same morning, an elderly janitor named Margaret quietly cleaned the marble floors before anyone arrived. She never complained, never argued, and always greeted everyone with a warm smile, even though most people ignored her. As Daniel walked toward the executive office, talking loudly on his phone about million-dollar deals, Margaret accidentally pushed her cleaning bucket into his path. Water splashed across the polished floor and onto Daniel's expensive Italian shoes. The hallway fell completely silent. Every employee stopped walking. Daniel's face turned red with anger. In front of everyone, he shouted, "Look what you've done! People like you don't belong in this company. You're nothing but a useless janitor." Several employees lowered their heads while others secretly recorded the scene on their phones. Margaret calmly picked up her bucket, looked Daniel in the eyes, and softly said, "Sometimes the people you look down on are the ones standing above you." Daniel laughed sarcastically and ordered security to escort her out immediately. As Margaret slowly walked toward the exit, she turned around one last time and quietly whispered, "I'll see you tomorrow, in the boardroom." Everyone laughed, believing an old janitor had finally lost her mind. But none of them knew that by sunrise, the most powerful secret in the company's history would be revealed, and Daniel Carter's life would change forever. The next morning, Carter Technologies looked different than ever before. Luxury black cars lined the entrance, security guards stood perfectly still, and the board of directors arrived one after another for the company's most important annual meeting. Daniel Carter walked confidently through the lobby, still laughing with his executives about the old janitor who had embarrassed herself the previous day. "I wonder if she's still looking for another cleaning job," he joked, making everyone around him laugh. Suddenly, the sound of a luxury limousine echoed across the parking area. Every security guard immediately stood at attention. The chairman of the board himself walked outside to welcome a special guest. Daniel frowned in confusion because he had never seen the chairman greet anyone personally before. The limousine door slowly opened, and a pair of elegant black heels stepped onto the red carpet. Moments later, the same elderly woman Daniel had humiliated yesterday stepped out, but this time she was dressed in an elegant navy blue business suit, wearing a simple diamond brooch and carrying a leather portfolio. Every board member stood up the moment they saw her. Several senior executives respectfully bowed their heads. Daniel's smile disappeared instantly. His heart began to race as he watched the woman calmly walk through the lobby where employees who had ignored her only yesterday now greeted her with the deepest respect. Whispering filled every corner of the building. "She's here," one executive said nervously. Daniel couldn't understand what was happening until the chairman walked toward the elderly woman, shook her hand, and loudly announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Margaret Anderson, the original co-founder of Carter Technologies and the largest shareholder of this company." The room fell into complete silence. Daniel felt the color drain from his face as memories of yesterday's humiliation flashed through his mind. Margaret looked directly into his eyes, smiled gently, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Carter. I told you we would meet again." In the boardroom, Daniel stood frozen as every board member welcomed Margaret with the respect reserved for legends. He couldn't believe the woman he had publicly humiliated less than 24 hours earlier was now sitting at the head of the boardroom table. The chairman cleared his throat and began speaking. 32 years ago, when this company was nothing more than a small garage with 3 employees, it was Margaret Anderson who invested her savings, built the first business plan, and stood beside Daniel's late father through every challenge. Without her, Carter Technologies would never have existed. The room remained silent as old photographs appeared on the large screen, showing a much younger Margaret working day and night beside the company's founders. After her husband passed away, the chairman continued, Margaret quietly stepped away from public life and handed daily operations to the next generation. But she never sold a single share. Instead, she spent years visiting our branches in secret, working as an ordinary janitor under a different employee ID to discover one thing: how people in this company truly treated those they believed had no power. Every executive lowered their eyes in shame. Margaret calmly looked around the room before speaking. Money can build a company, but character decides whether it deserves to survive. Yesterday, I wasn't disappointed because I was insulted. I was disappointed because the leader of this company judged a human being by a uniform instead of a heart. Daniel wanted to apologize, but no words came out. His confidence had disappeared completely. Margaret slowly closed the old leather folder in front of her and said, "Mr. Carter, your father once told me that leadership is earned through humility, not authority. Yesterday you proved that you have learned how to manage a business, but you have not yet learned how to lead people." The silence inside the boardroom became unbearable as everyone waited for her next decision, knowing that Daniel Carter's future would now be decided by the very woman he had called just a janitor. The silence inside the boardroom was finally broken when Margaret slowly stood up and walked toward Daniel. Every executive expected her to fire him immediately, but instead she placed a small employee ID card on the table. Daniel looked down in confusion. It wasn't a termination letter. It was a janitor's identification badge with his name printed on it. Margaret calmly said, "You won't lose your job today, Mr. Carter. But starting tomorrow, you will spend the next 30 days working as a janitor in this company. You will clean the same floors, empty the same trash bins, and wear the same uniform you once looked down upon. Only after you understand the people who keep this company alive, will you be allowed to sit in this chair again." The room was filled with shocked whispers. Some directors believed the punishment was too soft, while others knew it was far more difficult than being fired. Daniel's pride refused to accept it. "This is humiliating," he said angrily. Margaret looked into his eyes and replied, "No, Daniel, humiliation is when someone is treated as if they have no value simply because of their job. Yesterday, you taught that lesson to an innocent woman. Today, life is giving you the chance to learn it yourself." With no support from the board and no way to refuse, Daniel silently picked up the janitor's ID card. As he walked out of the boardroom carrying the same cleaning bucket Margaret had used only a day earlier, hundreds of employees watched in complete disbelief. The powerful CEO who once commanded an entire company was now beginning the first day of the hardest lesson of his life, unaware that the next 30 days would completely transform the man he thought he was. Daniel's first morning as a janitor felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The expensive tailored suits, private office, and luxury company car were gone. Instead, he stood in a gray cleaning uniform, holding a mop and a bucket while the same employees who once rushed to impress him now walked past without even looking at him. Some whispered behind his back, while others laughed quietly, unable to believe the former CEO was scrubbing the marble floors he had once walked across with pride. As the hours passed, Daniel's hands became sore, his back ached, and for the first time in his life he realized how exhausting honest physical work could be. During his lunch break, he sat alone in a small staff room where the cleaners, security guards, and cafeteria workers shared simple meals and stories about their lives. One elderly cleaner smiled and offered him half of his homemade sandwich, saying, "Around here we take care of each other because no one else notices us." Daniel was speechless. These were the same people he had ignored for years, yet they welcomed him without bitterness. Later that afternoon, he noticed a young cleaner secretly crying in the hallway after learning her son needed an expensive medical operation she couldn't afford. Another janitor quietly handed her his entire week's salary without asking for anything in return. Daniel watched the scene with tears forming in his eyes. For the first time, he understood that true wealth wasn't measured by bank accounts or luxury offices. It was measured by compassion, sacrifice, and the willingness to help others even when you had very little yourself. As he finished cleaning the last hallway that evening, Daniel looked at his own reflection in the polished floor and barely recognized the man staring back at him. The arrogant CEO was slowly disappearing, and in his place, a humble human being was beginning to emerge. Weeks passed, and the man who once believed power was everything had become someone the employees barely recognized. Daniel no longer cleaned the floors because he was forced to. He cleaned them with pride. Every morning, he arrived before sunrise to help the elderly janitors carry heavy supplies, repaired broken equipment with his own hands, and quietly left groceries outside the apartment of the young cleaner whose son needed surgery. He never told anyone it was him. One afternoon, while cleaning the lobby, a wealthy businessman accidentally dropped an expensive wallet filled with cash. For a brief moment, Daniel remembered the arrogant man he used to be, but without hesitation he ran after the stranger and returned every dollar untouched. The businessman offered him a generous reward, but Daniel smiled and politely refused, saying, "There was a time when I believed money solved every problem. Now I know that doing the right thing is worth far more." Hidden on the second floor, Margaret watched everything through the security cameras. For the first time since Daniel had become CEO, she smiled with quiet pride. He wasn't pretending anymore, he had truly changed. Word of his kindness spread throughout the company. Employees who once feared him now greeted him warmly, not because of his position, but because of the respect he had earned. One evening, as Daniel finished polishing the lobby floor, he noticed a handwritten envelope resting on his cleaning cart. Inside was a simple note from Margaret that read, "Tomorrow morning, be in the boardroom at exactly 9 o'clock. Your final lesson is about to begin." Daniel folded the letter carefully, took a deep breath, and looked around the building that had become his greatest teacher. For the first time in his life, he wasn't walking into the boardroom as a powerful CEO. He was walking in as a humble man who had finally learned the true meaning of leadership. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the boardroom exactly at 9 o'clock, still wearing the simple gray janitor's uniform that had become a symbol of the man he had become. As he opened the doors, every board member was already seated, but this time no one looked at him with pity or judgment. Instead, they stood up and applauded. Daniel froze in disbelief. Margaret slowly walked toward him with a warm smile and said, 30 days ago, you entered this room as a man who demanded respect because of his title. Today, you return as a man who has earned respect because of his character." Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he quietly lowered his head. Margaret turned toward the board and continued, "Over the past month, every employee was asked to report not on Daniel's performance as a janitor, but on his heart. They told me how he helped coworkers without expecting recognition, how he comforted people during difficult moments, how he returned a lost wallet without taking a single dollar, and how he treated every cleaner, security guard, and receptionist with the same respect he once reserved only for executives." The chairman smiled proudly and placed a new company badge on the table. "Daniel Carter," he announced, "the board has unanimously decided to restore your position as Chief Executive Officer." Daniel looked at the badge but didn't reach for it. Instead, he turned to Margaret and said, "If you truly believe I've changed, then my first decision as CEO is this. Every employee, no matter their position, will receive equal respect, better working conditions, and a fair opportunity to grow. No one in this company will ever feel invisible again." The room erupted into applause, but Margaret's eyes filled with tears because she knew that at that very moment, Carter Technologies hadn't just regained a CEO. It had finally found a true leader. As the applause slowly faded, Margaret picked up the old janitor's ID card that had changed Daniel's life and placed it beside his new CEO badge. She smiled gently and said, "Never throw this away. One badge gave you authority. The other gave you wisdom." Daniel carefully placed both badges in his pocket, knowing they would remain together forever. That same afternoon, he announced a series of changes that transformed Carter Technologies into one of the most respected companies in the country. Every employee, from the janitors to the executives, received equal respect, improved benefits, and an open-door policy where every voice mattered. The cleaning staff were invited to company meetings for the very first time, and Daniel personally thanked each one of them for the work they had done for years without recognition. Months later, Carter Technologies was named one of the best workplaces in the nation, not because it made the highest profits, but because it treated every human being with dignity. One evening, as Daniel walked through the quiet lobby, he saw a young intern accidentally spill coffee across the polished floor. The frightened employee immediately apologized, expecting to be shouted at just as Daniel once would have done. Instead, Daniel smiled, picked up a mop and said, "Don't worry, accidents can be cleaned. A broken heart is much harder to fix." The young employee looked at him in disbelief, while Margaret watched silently from the hallway with tears of pride in her eyes. She knew her greatest investment had never been the company. It had been the transformation of one human soul. As Daniel looked at the old janitor's badge one final time, he whispered, "Thank you for teaching me that the strongest leaders are not the ones who stand above others, but the ones who are willing to stand beside them." And from that day forward, Every new employee at Carter Technologies heard the same story during their first day of work. A reminder that titles may earn authority, money may buy comfort, but only kindness, humility, and respect can earn a legacy that lasts forever. On his very first day back as CEO, Daniel refused to enter the executive elevator. Instead, he walked through the main entrance where every employee, from the reception desk to the cleaning staff, greeted him with smiles instead of fear. Standing in the center of the lobby, he gathered the entire company and said, "Today, I don't want to speak as your CEO. I want to speak as someone who was given a second chance." The building became completely silent. Daniel continued, 30 days ago, I believed success was measured by profit, power, and expensive offices. I was wrong. This company has never been built by one CEO. It has been built every single day by the security guards who protect us through the night, the cleaners who arrive before sunrise, the receptionists who welcome every visitor with a smile, the cafeteria staff who feed us, and every employee who works with honesty when no one is watching. Many employees wiped tears from their eyes as they listened. Daniel then announced the largest employee welfare program in the company's history. Every janitor, cleaner, and support worker would receive higher salaries, full health insurance for their families, paid education opportunities for their children, and a special recognition award celebrating years of loyal service. The elderly cleaner who had once shared half of his sandwich with Daniel was invited onto the stage, where Daniel hugged him in front of everyone and said, "The greatest lesson I learned in this company didn't come from a boardroom. It came from you." The entire auditorium erupted into a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Hidden near the back of the room, Margaret watched quietly with tears in her eyes, knowing the company had changed forever. But just as the celebration was ending, Daniel noticed Margaret slowly walking toward the exit alone. Before anyone could stop her, she smiled one last time and whispered, "My work here is finally complete." She stepped into the waiting black limousine and disappeared without telling anyone where she was going, leaving behind one final mystery that would change Daniel's life once again. A year passed and Carter Technologies became one of the most admired companies in the country, not because it earned the highest profits, but because it treated every employee like family. Business magazines praised its culture, universities studied its leadership model, and companies from around the world tried to copy its values. Yet despite all the success, Daniel never stopped wondering where Margaret had gone after leaving the company that day. Then, one quiet autumn morning, he received a handwritten letter with no return address. His hands trembled as he recognized Margaret's elegant handwriting. The letter read, "Dear Daniel, if you're reading this, it means my journey has finally come to an end. I never wanted to be remembered as the richest shareholder or the company's co-founder. I wanted to leave knowing that this company would always be led by someone who valued people more than profit. You have given me that peace." Tears rolled down Daniel's face as he continued reading. Margaret revealed that she had been quietly battling a serious illness for years, but she chose to spend her remaining time teaching one final lesson instead of seeking recognition. At the end of the letter, she made one last request. "Promise me that no employee will ever feel invisible again." Daniel folded the letter against his heart and drove to the small countryside home where Margaret had spent her final days. Standing beside a simple wooden bench she loved, he whispered, "You didn't just save this company. You saved me." In the weeks that followed, Daniel fulfilled her final wish by announcing the Margaret Anderson Foundation, a program that provided scholarships for employees' children, financial support for struggling families, free education for janitors and support staff, and emergency assistance for anyone facing hardship. At the inauguration ceremony, thousands gathered as a bronze statue of Margaret was unveiled, not showing her in an expensive business suit, but wearing the simple janitor's uniform that had changed an entire company. Beneath the statue, a single sentence was engraved forever. "True greatness is not found in the position you hold, but in the lives you choose to lift." As the crowd stood in complete silence, Daniel realized that Margaret's greatest legacy had never been the company she built. It was the kindness she planted in every heart she touched. 10 years passed and Carter Technologies had become one of the most respected companies in the world. Business schools taught Daniel Carter's leadership philosophy, global CEOs visited the headquarters to learn the company's unique culture, and thousands of young professionals dreamed of working there. Yet the most visited place inside the company's magnificent headquarters wasn't the executive floor. It was a small room called the Margaret Anderson Legacy Hall. Inside the hall stood a simple cleaning bucket, an old gray janitor's uniform, a worn employee ID card, and the wooden mop that had changed the destiny of an entire company. Every new employee, from interns to senior executives, was required to visit the hall before starting work. One morning, a nervous young intern accidentally spilled an entire tray of coffee across the marble lobby. The frightened intern immediately dropped to his knees, apologizing over and over, convinced his career was already over. The entire lobby became silent as Daniel Carter, now older with gray hair but the same humble smile, slowly walked toward him. Instead of shouting, Daniel knelt beside the young man, picked up another mop, and quietly began cleaning the floor with him. The intern looked at him in complete disbelief and asked, "Sir, why are you helping me? You're the CEO." Daniel smiled warmly and replied, "Because many years ago, someone taught me that a leader's first responsibility isn't to stand above people, it's to stand beside them." He then led the young employee into the Margaret Anderson Legacy Hall, where they stood together in front of the old janitor's uniform. Daniel gently touched the faded name badge and said, "The greatest teacher I ever had never sat in this office, never wore an expensive suit, and never asked for recognition. She carried a cleaning bucket, walked these halls in silence, and changed my life forever." As the young intern quietly wiped away his tears, Daniel looked toward Margaret's framed photograph on the wall and whispered with a grateful smile, "Even after all these years, you're still leading this company." At that very moment, every person who entered the hall understood that Carter Technologies had not become great because of its wealth or success. It had become unforgettable because one humble janitor had taught an entire generation that kindness is the most powerful form of leadership. 20 years later, Daniel Carter stood on the same stage where he had once been introduced as the youngest CEO in the company's history. His hair had turned silver, but the kindness in his eyes had never faded. Thousands of employees, business leaders, students, and families filled the auditorium as the world watched Carter Technologies celebrate its 50th anniversary. Standing beside him was the company's newly elected CEO, a young woman who had started her career years earlier as a receptionist. Daniel smiled proudly as he handed her the CEO badge and said, "Never forget, leadership begins the moment you choose people over power." The audience erupted into applause, but Daniel raised his hand for one final request. "Before I leave this stage forever," he said softly, "there is one person who deserves the loudest applause in this company's history." The lights dimmed, and a giant photograph of Margaret Anderson appeared on the screen, showing her wearing the simple gray janitor's uniform she had once walked through these halls in every morning. The entire audience stood in complete silence before slowly applauding with tears in their eyes. Daniel then carried an old cleaning bucket and a worn janitor's ID card onto the stage and placed them beside the CEO badge. Looking toward the crowd, he said, "People often ask me who taught me how to build a billion-dollar company. The truth is, a janitor taught me how to become a human being first. Without Margaret Anderson, there would have been no great CEO, no great company, and no legacy worth remembering." His voice trembled as he continued, "Success gave me comfort, but humility gave me purpose. Wealth built these buildings, but kindness built this family." At that moment, every employee, from the newest cleaner to the senior executives, rose from their seats and applauded for several minutes. Some were crying openly, knowing they weren't just honoring a woman, they were honoring the values that had changed thousands of lives. As Daniel slowly walked off the stage for the final time, he paused beside Margaret's portrait, gently touched the old janitor's badge and whispered, "Thank you for seeing the man I could become before I ever saw it myself." The lights slowly faded as one final message appeared on the screen. "People will forget your title. They will forget your salary. They may even forget your success. But they will never forget how you made them feel. Because true greatness is not measured by the power you hold, but by the lives you lift." And with those words, the story of Carter Technologies came to an end. But the lesson Margaret Anderson left behind continued to inspire every person who walked through its doors, proving that the greatest leaders are not remembered for the offices they occupied, but for the hearts they changed forever.